All right, it is my pleasure and privilege to be up here with my wonderful colleagues to introduce you all to our project called Fish Outlaws. And I'll give you just a minute to wrap up your conversations and we'll shift into gear here. So this is a project that recognizes that for the past 200 years, colonizers of the Pacific Northwest have usurped access to the fisheries on which we Indigenous peoples have lived independently since time immemorial. Indigenous fishing methods have not been honored, while traditional harvesting practices have, in many places, been appropriated to the exclusion of Indigenous harvesters. And throughout this region's recorded history, colonial powers have done so much to thwart Indigenous fishers, which we have seen really demonstrated through a lot of the conversations we've been having in this room today, yesterday, even the day prior. Whether that be like the confiscation of gears, the enforced exclusion from certain waters, incarceration of tribal and First Nations fishers, threats of violence being acted upon by authorities when fishers have stood up for their inherent rights. So this is a project to draw attention to these conversations, to challenge this norm that we see coast to coast to coast and well beyond. So this is a project that we have started here in this region, looking at the Salish Sea, but broadening out from the geography where we lived when this project all began, and kind of growing out from that point. This is an initiative that is supported by the National Geographic Society. The four of us are National Geographic explorers, and we are very much here to think about what that means. That is a hugely problematic term. We recognize that the National Geographic Society has done a tremendous amount of harm and committed violence and upheld extraction in a lot of these contexts. And so for us, we're really wanting to use these funds to challenge that history and that norm. What we're doing through this work is really aimed at upholding Indigenous data sovereignty. All that we share through this work is really centered on prioritizing community interests. There's going to be an opportunity towards the end of our session to hear from you all, kind of your visions of fisheries justice, and none of that is going direct to the hands of the National Geographic Society. That is going towards our project to inform the recommendations that we produce. So just wanting to front load that context. So Saul, Ken, others have given us a lot of lead-in to think about what it means to be outlaws, to be rendered outlaws for practicing what are our culturally inherent rights. And I just want to draw our attention to the definitions of what it means to be an outlaw. When it's used as a noun, it's a person who's broken the law, especially one who remains at large or is a fugitive. When we talk about it in the sense of a verb, it's banning or making illegal. And interestingly, that's often the application that we're seeing within this, that it's applied in a way that renders our activities illegal. And what we're doing in this work, as I just noted, is not just drawing attention to this critical issue, but thinking about what fisheries justice looks like and means for all of us. And this is a story, this is a set of stories that doesn't belong strictly within academic spaces. And so that's really at the heart of why we have convened a poet, a photographer, different kinds of scholarship in this space to do all of these relationships justice. So my name is Andrea Reid. I've come to know many of you in this room over the past few days, if not prior. I'm a citizen of the Nisga'a Nation, current lead for the Center for Indigenous Fisheries at the University of British Columbia, and it's my honor to be here with all of you today. And I'm going to pass the microphone first to my colleague, Reid Priest. And Reid is a poet. She's a member of the Lac-Timish Lummi Nation. Her literary debut, Patriarchy Blues, was honored with the 2018 American Book Award, and she is the Poet Laureate of Washington State. So please welcome Reid with me, please.
Nautsi o helix and quanasatla tiakaias, the hueltanats and a snatch ochlamisen. Hello, everyone. I'm just so pleased to be here with you today to share a few words. So I'll just start with talking about what a poet laureate is. The term of laureate comes from the ancient Greek when they would honor heroes and poets and athletes and leaders with the crown of laurels as a symbol of protection and honor. And that means that it comes obviously with a lot of work. Oh, hey, how about that? Is that better? Do I sound a little less? Okay, great. So it also is, you've heard the term resting on your laurels, and you just don't do that. So I've been very busy visiting communities throughout Washington State. I visit schools and college, universities, and environmental organizations and libraries, just pretty much anyone who asks me to come and share poetry and talk about my work. I respond to the call and make every effort to get there. And poetry, it's a needed way to communicate, right? Because story, when I got appointed as poet laureate, people asked, you know, what's the word for poem in your language? And so I went to my teachers and I said, well, what is that word? I don't know that word. And they said, well, you know, shwiam is a story, and stilam is a song, and tiwich is a prayer. And so it's a story, and it's a song, and it's a prayer. This is what poetry is. And I'm taught that stories were how we communicated, you know, Indigenous ways of knowing it. Our science was in there, our instructions on civic engagement, how to behave in a community, how to behave with non-human communities. All of that was contained in our stories, our spiritual beliefs. It wasn't separate. They weren't, you know, there wasn't science over here and humanities over here. And as a poet, I consider myself an iteration in this storytelling tradition. That's what I've been told is my role. And so it's kind of a bringing together of the stories and the prayers and the songs and our Indigenous ways of knowing. And I'll just start with a poem here called Sui Tu Ie Shatanakwin, meaning the truly beautiful earth. This used to be a garden. Before the strangers came with strange beliefs, they claimed to be cursed with something they called original sin, but blessed with something they called dominion over the whole living earth. They tore apart the garden, insisted that the savage wilds be conquered and subdued in order to be improved. We are part of the earth, thus their belief that we too must be subdued. Have they forgotten this used to be a garden? On the seventh day, do they look upon their work and see that it is good? I think we need our old beliefs to guide us back to the garden beyond that gate, guarded by their angel with a fiery sword. This used to be a garden. I don't think the strangers knew how the garden grew so carefully attuned to the rhythms and tones of the earth's own beautiful song, sung for untold millennia before they came along. This used to be a garden. It fed us and loved us, and we loved it. We still do, or at least the memory of it. I've heard it said that half histories are half truths and half truths are lies. Let me tell it to you whole. This used to be a garden. So I share that poem and I tell a story about how, you know, one of our traditional stories talking about the mountains, we have Quilshan and Kwame, which is Mount Baker and Mount Rainier. And I don't think Mr. Baker ever saw his mountain. I'm not sure about Mr. Rainier. But, you know, those beings, they are beings. They are living, existing beings. They have a purpose in our, you know, cosmology. They were together at one time. And then Kwame, for one reason or another, she decided to move south. And on her way, she made the islands of the Salish Sea. And on each of the islands, she left a gift for the people. And you can hear it by the place names. Lummi Island, it's Samamiach, which is where the deer live, you know, and Vindovi Island, it's Penachwang, which is where you dig. It's where we harvested camas roots. And so the whole area that we lived in was considered a garden, and there were teachings along with that story that went with each of those islands. Anyway, so Kwame, she left a gift at each of these islands when she moved south down to where she is now in central Washington. And, on a clear day, you can see from our territory at Lummi down to where Mount Rainier is now. And it's said that Quilshan also, he'll see her on a beautiful sunny day standing there looking so regal and beautiful. And then she'll notice him looking at her. And then she'll say, no. And then she'll draw the clouds around her again. And that's why it's rainy in Washington all the time. So, stories, they have a power to connect us to the place, to things in a way that, I think maybe numbers and other things that we're so used to dealing with, information, other ways of getting information, don't connect us in quite the same way as a story. So this, I think, also is the role of poetry. And the poem that I just read, it speaks a little bit to the idea of the story that we all have inherited, which is the Christian story, that has not left room for other stories in any way. And it's a dull instrument in terms of having a way to relate to our world, right? The scholar, he's a scholar of Indigenous literatures, Arnold Krupat. I was in a workshop of his recently, and he talked about, out of the thousands of creation stories that he's read from Indigenous cultures throughout the world, none of them, they all have the people coming up out of the dirt, arising out of the dirt, and then learning what their place is in the world, and learning how to interact with all of the other beings that they share that space with. There's only one story that has the people coming up out of the dirt and then being ejected from the garden. And so that was the inspiration for the poem that I just read. And of course, that story is Christianity. And the role of the poet also is to say difficult and uncomfortable things. I'm not bound by needing to win an election or impress any funders, or have my research funded. So I can say the things that need to be said, the hard things that need to be said, and challenge some of the deeply held beliefs that people cherish so much with truth. And I think that that's really the role of the poet also. So this poem is called The Miracle of the Fishes. I don't want to get into a thing where we're arguing about whose spiritual hero is better. But salmon are more powerful than Jesus. All salmon are born from virgins. Actually, they're born right out of the earth. Female salmon lay eggs in a riverbed. The males come and fertilize them. No male-female contact is made. How chaste. Young salmon make their journey to the sea, then return to perform the miracle of the fishes. They spawn and die, and their nutrient-rich bodies and blood, infused with the minerals of the living sea, feed all living beings in the salmon's natal stream. A salmon needs only itself and its journey to perform this miraculous feat. This beautiful and holy communion between salmon and all living things has been happening longer than people have been on this planet. On the other hand, basic transubstantiation requires a priest, a church, an altar, a tabernacle, an altar boy, a glass of wine, a tray of wafers, a bell, a Bible, dogma, an initiated congregation, the Spanish Inquisition, a history of burning women as witches, a history of stealing and starving Indian kids, a history of holy wars, a history of displacing and or murdering heathen Indians in the name of God in order to propagate a story about a boy born from a virgin whose body and blood we eat and drink so we shall be saved. Saved from what? Not from hunger or thirst, but from everlasting damnation in the burning pits of hell, which, if I close my eyes to visualize, look like hunger and thirst on this broken and burning earth. So That one I usually will preface with the discussion about how it wasn't until 1978 when President Jimmy Carter passed the Native American Religious Freedoms Act that it was legal even for Indigenous peoples to practice our spirituality, to practice the first salmon ceremony, to practice our sacred obligation to harvest in the way that we were taught in order to propagate the runs and keep them healthy. It was illegal. You could, be fined, have all of your gear confiscated, be thrown in jail, have your children taken away and put up for adoption and never see them again for harvesting out of season, right? This is a thing. This happened. It was a thing until 1978 when that law was passed. So if I don't ever try to apologize to Christian sensibilities, because I want them to know that, Indigenous ways of knowing and being have to be respected in the same way that their belief systems have been respected. And I say nothing untrue in that last poem that I share. Is there a slide for me?
Yes. You advance.
Oh, I advance it.
One big button.
Big one, okay. So this next poem that I'll share, and this is the poem I'll close with. It's called Remembering Tata at Tamhuikson, and Tata is the affectionate name for mother in my language, and Tamhuikson is a place name for Gooseberry Point. Also, I gotta say, you guys are a tough crowd. I'm used to poets, and they like laugh and applaud and things like that, like humanities communities, they're like, yeah, and they do the snaps, all of that, So scientists, fisheries managers, you're a tough bunch. I'm going to have to warn the other poets about you. Okay, so this poem is called Remembering Tata at Tamhuikson. And I teach workshops. I've been teaching a workshop called How to Catch a Salmon Poem, and I'll share a little bit about what I share with my workshop attendees after I read the poem. A glossary of bell-related words, chimes, sings, peals, tolls. It is a feeling of silver. It rings and shines at the edges. Like the scales of a fish, it flickers, tintinnabulates, the signal of a charm, of magic, of a movie memory sequence. And then there is Mother, home from the cannery, covered in the scales of hundreds of gutted fish. She shimmers like a mermaid. Long day, I ask. When I lunch at noon, she replies, the sky is a polished silver spoon. By quitting time, tarnish has overtaken all signs of shine. That's how long the day is. You must have cleaned a lot of fish, I say. I think we cleaned out all of Puget Sound. There used to be gooseberries at Gooseberry Point. Now there is the cannery. Won't be long before all the fish are gone. Then the cannery will go and all we'll have is hunger and sorrow. A burden is the heaviest bell of a carillon. Its register is low. I wish I had a magic wand to chime the cheerful sound of gooseberries sprouting up out of the ground. So, now I don't believe you. It's not even genuine. Just kidding. All right. Anyway, so the thing that one of the prompts that I give them several prompts, what is poetry, and then write everything that you know about salmon, and then I ask them to write about a wish. And then I give them the example. What I know about salmon, that is in 1903, the largest cannery in the world was in my territory. It was in Bellingham, Washington, which is Lummi territory, Clackamas in my homelands. And this might not be that cannery, but this is a visual image of the horrors that happened there. They had so much fish coming in that they couldn't process it all before, it would spoil. And so they had initiated the practice of just dumping it all back out into the bay. And it's in our oral history that it would wash up on the shores and it would create this terrible stench. And well, they must have gotten, some kind of pushback for that, because I didn't know this until I was sharing what I just shared with you at a reading that I had given. And one of the audience members came up and she gave me a little piece of oral history from her own family. She said, when my dad was a boy, he remembers seeing a barge piled high out on Bellingham Bay. And he asked his dad, what is that? And because, there were birds swarming all over it. And he said, oh, the canneries, they can't process all the fish. So they they load them onto the barge and they push them out into the bay so that they can, rot out of sight of, kind of offshore. And so unless you're downwind, you don't get it. Anyway, so it's in the oral record too. And you don't get these stories just like, you kind of have to go out and find them and dig for them, or you have to have somebody come and volunteer this information, right? Be it a poetry reading and share some of your stories. So all the while, all the time that this was happening, again, I said it was illegal for my people to be out fishing. It wasn't until 1973 that we got the right to fish back. And even then that came with stipulations. We had to run hatcheries in order to replenish what we took. And so tribes now say that those hatchery fish are treaty fish. But there's not really great science, which I understand, to support that the hatcheries are. Anyway, maybe this is heading off into politics, but the poet is supposed to shatter polite conversation everywhere, right? So anyways, while this was happening, we were not allowed to be on the water. Generations of women in my family worked in the canneries. I'm the first generation to not work in a cannery since all of this was happening. And it's not because it was like we all had this revelation, like, oh, maybe we shouldn't do that anymore. It was like there are no more fish, so there no more canneries. And what I think about is that we were promised in our treaties the right to fish in common. This obviously did not happen. We were not fishing in common when all of this was happening. So what does that mean to me? Imagining just futures. For people who are not indigenous to the region where this kinds of destruction happened, for them it's an act of imagination to imagine a just future. For indigenous peoples, it's an act of remembrance. So what did we do before? How did we behave with the fish before? I don't think we had hatcheries. I'm pretty sure we managed according to the teachings that came down through our stories, that came down through our way of feeling connected to where we live, to not thinking of the fish as a resource as much as sacred nourishment for all living beings in the region, right? That was a part of the stories. So thinking about how to communicate that to to policymakers. This is where we need voices of poets, of storytellers, of people who can help shape imagination, because it's hard to come from a place saying where we need to change if we don't have like an emotional investment in that need to change. And if you think about how Christianity overtook the whole world, in many places it was by force, but it was the story that enabled people to be able to do the things that they did, stealing children from their families and burning witches and things like that. It was the story. It was the story that they believed in. And so we have to tell stories that make us love the salmon, that make us love the salmon to the same degree as religious zealots who have, just feel that it's their God-given duty and right to impose on others. We need to impose on others, okay? So that's all from me, Aishka.
Thank you, Rena. That was wonderful. And next I'll welcome up Amy Romer, who is a visual artist and storyteller and photojournalist to join us.
I'm Amy Roma. I'm, as part of the Fish Outlaws project, I'm the photographer and visual journalist. I live on Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh territory in North Vancouver, and you can hear from my accent that I'm either Australian or English. But I'm English, and I've been living here for 6 years. And as a photojournalist in the UK, where I'm from, I just want to give you a little bit of background and to tell you why I'm here today doing this. I worked on a story for a number of years about modern slavery and human trafficking in the UK, which at the time wasn't spoken about or really understood as a modern day issue, which is exactly why I wanted to work on it and to try to raise awareness of it. So that is to say, when I moved to Vancouver, I was really looking for what that story might be here. And to my surprise, I kept coming back to salmon, just as this very cherished, loved species that is depended on, and like Dr. Stephen Point said earlier, is also treated like a commodity, and for that reason, there's so much politics around salmon, which really interested and fascinated me, but also made me really sad. But I wanted to work on this story, and so I applied, as my colleagues did at some point in time, to work on stories about salmon through the National Geographic Society. And my story was about the causes of salmon decline and the effects on coastal communities here in the region. And that's how I met these 3 women. We were all salmon storytellers. And so when we decided to come together to build this, sorry, I haven't been doing the slides. When we decided to come together to do this kind of super project where we have these multiple disciplines and multiple storytelling methods, we began this through the pandemic, is something I should mention. And so until about 2 months ago, none of us had even met in person. Our relationship and work has existed on Zoom calls, as I know we're all very familiar with. But through those conversations on Zoom, I've had the privilege over the last 1.5 years to listen and to learn from particularly Rena and Andrea about the history and context of this issue that we're working on the criminalization of Indigenous fishers. And through those conversations, I've been able to extend and really branch off in my own direction to try to, as a photographer, how do you visually represent that story? And along that path, I've been able to connect with Nuchalnath fishers through the Ha'um Fisheries Society, who have had me along on a couple of their trips into the community, where I've learned first-hand experiences of criminalization, the confiscation of technology, the burning of boats, discrimination from DFO, and the discrimination and violence from white fishers. And alongside that, I've been able to, again, listen to Lauren and Andrea's conversations with some key players in this space who they've interviewed to inform their scientific research. And as I'm listening to their conversations, I'm weaving together all of this context and history and conversations I've had myself, and photography that I'm starting to build. And I think that's really what the power is of this team, of this collaboration, which is to be able to include multiple voices through multiple channels, through poetry and writing and photography and scientific research and analysis, to in some and sometimes combine those storytelling methods, sometimes give them the space on their own, and eventually we will be pulling everything together and producing, you know, this multidiscipline project. So I think that by doing that, we're really able to interrogate what, you know, how have we got here today? And what does it look like? What does criminalization look like today? And most importantly, what do we want it to look like tomorrow and into the future? And so I want to quite quickly pass along to Lauren to speak more about the interviews and the academic process that's included within the Fish Outlaws project. And so Lauren Eckert is a conservation scientist at the University of Victoria, pursuing equitable, pluralistic conservation research and practice. And it's my pleasure to introduce her.
Thanks so much, Amy. I'm really humbled to be here in front of you and to be a member of this incredible team of women. As Amy mentioned, wow, this is hard to figure out. No one was lying. Where do I point? You got it. Oh, no, I went too far. I'm too afraid to press now. There you go. Wow, okay. So quickly transitioning, effortless. So part of the role, as Amy mentioned, of these profound images that have been going on the screen is to further illustrate in these impactful ways the stories shared with our team, with our Fish Outlaws team, both those sitting here and our communities, partners, collaborators beyond. And as a team, we are able to listen to our partners in this work, led by our partners in this work, and listen about their stories of wrongful criminalization, many of which we've heard pieces of this weekend and today, through an interview process. And the interviews that we're doing with folks started in this region, the Salish Sea bioregion, as it's now called, where we all live and work and have relationships and have communities. But it's expanded given the universality of the problem of overcriminalization, unjust criminalization of Indigenous fishers as they exercise their inherent rights to fish in their territories. And so these interviews that we engage in are both backward and forward looking. And we ask knowledge holders about their life experiences in their lands and in their waters, about the nature of inherent Indigenous fishing rights, about fishing technologies, the impacts of the bolt and sparrow decisions and other imposed colonial law and following decisions. And we also ask often about what kind of actions lead to just futures, what just futures might look like. And in one focal partnership, I had the immense privilege of co-supervising UBC undergraduate student in the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, Nicole Jung, alongside Joni Olson and Shauna Johnson at the Wasanich Leadership Council. And we worked with the Wasanich Leadership Council as partners in a process of creating community-engaged work that seeks to compile information about the criminalization of Wasanich fisheries and Wasanich fishers, but also orient the project and its community products towards supporting a pathway towards just futures. So Nicole asked people, knowledge holders, fishers, elders, what Douglas Treaty rights mean to Wasanich fishers, what it is to fish as formerly, where Indigenous rights come from, and how we might collectively build a better future built on the recognition of these Indigenous fishing rights. And also we discussed not just rights, but responsibilities, what it means to uphold responsibilities to each other as a community, to kin and to fish. And we're able to do this work through deeply community embedded, joyful, participatory events like workshops, time in community, these interviews. We're engaging people of all ages across communities in various roles in their communities to share their stories, their histories, their presence, and their futures. And in doing so, as Andrea briefly mentioned, we also have the incredible opportunity, and rightfully so, to prioritize directing our National Geographic funding towards honoraria for interviewees, towards gifts, towards meeting, towards being in spaces together, towards gathering, and importantly, towards youth engagement. And we also are prioritizing things like feeding people great food, as I hear has been the case all weekend here. Being human together, being in these spaces together as people, not research subjects or researchers, but as humans with responsibilities to each other and with a shared interest in building a better world together. And so ultimately, we hope that this project can support the work of gathering together as individuals lead us in envisioning just futures. And now I will hand off to my colleague, Dr. Andrea Reid, who continues to inspire me every day in all the ways, and also knows how to use the clicker.
As my team has made clear, none of this work is happening without this kind of collaboration and really action orientation and community centering in the work that we do. And I just wanted to share briefly that those are very much the mandates, the motivations behind the Center for Indigenous Fisheries at the University of British Columbia. We launched in January of last year amidst the height of the pandemic, but are eager to be engaging with folks in person now that this is becoming more possible yet again. And through the Fish Outlaws Project, it's been just a brilliant pleasure to bring that action orientation, that community centering towards youth, and thinking about how we carry these conversations away from that place of loss and hardship towards joy and towards possibility. And so we've been able to engage with the Tawasin Youth Stewardship Group that you see here, having conversations, engaging with a fisher poet, Wilfred Wilson, for those that might know him, and spending time on the water, creating these connections between generations and eating our foods, as Lauren said, and thinking about what our futures can look like, and thinking about how we can get there, how we might recreate some of our traditional fishing tools, technologies, thinking about our role in all of this and how we might push back against, like we heard yesterday, like rescinding the papal bull and rejecting terra nullius and refusing the doctrine of discovery, and moving past these really problematic kind of policies that constrain us to a time that possibly never existed. These are ridiculous impositions that get imposed on Indigenous fishers, and really that's the power of this project, is pointing a giant spotlight on this issue, increasing literacy of what Indigenous fishing rights are so that we as a collective can truly begin to uphold them and think about that together. And so in these last 2 minutes that we have allocated in this time slot, we wanted to invite you all to think about, there's little Post-it notes on your tables. We want you to think about, what does it mean for you to imagine those just futures, to remember those just realities? And we would love to bring those into our work if that's something that you would like to offer towards this initiative. We would love to reflect, carry who you are as a knowledge keeper, as a community member. If you wish to identify yourself, please do, or share any story anonymously with us, and that can still inform our process. So that's where we'll leave it today. I just want to thank you all for your time, attention, involvement, and wide open door. There are so many brilliant knowledge keepers among us here. If you would be interested in an interview or community-centered work on these subjects, let's talk about it. Thank you.